But maybe we can agree that for most of us, or for many of the people we know, oftentimes our lives feel like a series of interruptions. That maybe our lives, more often than not, feel incoherent rather than coherent. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could find something that would give order to the incoherence? That would move us from a series of interruptions to a sense of continuity in our lives. What Tim O'Malley has done with this book is pointed us to the Catholic Mass. And he points us to the Catholic Mass to see that if we engage in the Mass, in the order of the Mass, in the meaning of the Mass, over and over again, slowly, over time, perhaps growing in understanding, that we will find that the order of the Mass and the meaning of the Mass will reshape our lives. We'll take on that order. We'll take on that meaning. And all of those interruptions, or that sense of incoherence, will begin to feel like we have a sense of continuity, identity, and even mission. I want to offer an image that's not in the book, but it's hard to talk about the entire book from something in the book. So I want to step out of the book for a moment and give you an image that actually came to my mind as I've meditated on what Tim has produced in this book. And in this image, from what's called the St. John's Illuminated Bible, just this beautiful work of art coming out of Collegeville, Minnesota, and Donald Jackson, the chief artist who put this together over the course of nearly 2 decades. This image goes along with the very beginning of Genesis, Genesis 1, the creation narrative. All throughout this illuminated Bible, there are images and figures that punctuate the words. In fact, the words of Scripture come to us as images to nourish our imaginations. But I thought of this particular image when I was contemplating Tim's book, and precisely what I've said already, that he's pointing us to the Mass as that which can give our lives and will give our lives order and meaning. Here's why. This image presents to us the 6 days of creation, and then the 7th day from Genesis 1, beginning all the way over here on your left, from darkness to light, and moving panel by panel, 6 of them, into the 7th day, the Sabbath, the day of rest, which is solidly gold. Gold being the color in iconography that presents glory. It's always associated with God's glory. And on the 7th day, it's pure glory. But it's not just one of the 7 days. In fact, it's the order for all of them. And you can see this in this artwork by these little fractals of light that are going back across. Can you see those now? That up on the 6th day, it's almost the entire panel. On the 5th day, a little bit less, but all the way even on the 1st day, there's already the hint of glory that's there. That in this work of art, everything is moving, in fact, from your left to your right, towards that Sabbath day. Now, I thought of this image and this piece of art because I think that is a really telling sort of idea or image of what Tim is telling us about the Catholic Mass. That as we move towards it, as we practice it, as we engage in it, our lives are drawn into it, are given meaning and order, and that in fact we're going somewhere. Our lives mean something, and in fact mean something very solid, very glorious by the end. Tim wrote this book because earlier in the church's history, there were a number of manuals, guides for lay people for engaging in the Mass. And he noticed that in the present age, we don't have these so much anymore. Ways for the laity to fully engage in the Mass. So the next thing I want to show is just a little segment from his book about what he's hoping to do with this, to provide a lay handbook, as it will. So let's look at that. He calls it a lay Mass primer, and here it is from page 12. The need for these books, this kind of book, has increased insofar as we are not simply to hear Mass on a Sunday, but to participate so fully in the Eucharist that our work, our family life, and our friendships take on a Eucharistic tenor. Do you get that? That our lives are meant to begin to be shaped by and even sound like the Eucharist that we practice at Mass. The gift that Tim has given us in this book is that he has listened attentively, compassionately even, to what many of us struggle with in the Mass, what many of us do not understand about the Mass. And we may not even know that we don't understand it. We don't know there's anything there to understand at certain moments, perhaps. And after listening compassionately and generously, he has taken the time to delicately and clearly help us to see what we didn't see before. And once we start to see it, our imaginations are opened up and our wonder is sparked. Now, for those of you who have read this book already and you're already very knowledgeable about the Mass, you're formed in it, that's a good thing. You might have been going through and been saying, of course, of course. And if you were saying, of course, that's an excellent thing. It means it's resonating with you and you've been formed for it. But we can think about the gift of this work in another way then. Maybe it's not for our benefit alone, but for those who do not yet know, who do not yet understand, who would benefit from a deeper understanding of the Mass. I think the gift that Tim has given us is that he has put into words what we might like to say to others. So when we hear that Old Testament reading and that gospel together, what do we hear resonating between the two? How are we hearing it? How are we being presented with images of God's engagement in human history for our own good, for his glory and the glory of all the world? That's the golden thread. So the very practical piece of advice here is prepare for that. Prepare to hear it. Practice reading the scripture beforehand and pay attention to where that golden thread is. There's one piece. What helps us to prepare. Another piece I'd like to look at is from another section of the book, on the Colic Prayer, which seems like a smaller, more subtle movement in the Mass. But this, as Tim presents it, is a movement of transition. Perhaps a movement of transition from how we've been preparing to what we will now participate in. And he pauses right here at this very short prayer. And as he says, a Colic Prayer receives its name because it collects the prayers of the assembly gathered for worship. After the Gloria, a moment of silence should fill the church. Here, the entire assembly should be praying to God within their hearts. After a few moments, the priest joins his hands together and invites us to pray. Now, this is not the first time we have been praying during Mass. Rather, the individual prayers that have been welling up in our hearts are now joined together through the voice of the church. Notice how he slowed us down at this very subtle moment of the Mass to help us to recognize what's happening, this moment of transition. Who's coming into the Mass? Well, each of us, as we are, with our set of concerns and our prayers already in motion. All of those things are being taken into that Eucharistic assembly. We come in praying our own prayers, and those prayers, those concerns are welcome. But what happens here in the Colic Prayer? It's not that those individual prayers and concerns go away. No, in fact, they're gathered together in the one prayer that the priest presides over on our behalf. And if we think about this, maybe if we can see it, we can see the kind of sound that's happening. We can see that the many voices are joining together into one voice, the voice of the church. It's already in this part what the whole Mass is meant to do, to take all of our voices, to not forget any single one, but to bring them into a harmony, sort of polyphony, where it's not just one simple monotone voice, but it's many voices that sing together. And that's what's happening in the Colic. This transition from how we've prepared, from where we've been, to who we're becoming in the center of the Mass. Next, then, I want to say something about the participation. And here's one point that I would pause on. The prayer over the offerings. And let's notice what Tim has written here in two sections, as it were. One in the middle of the chapter, and at the end in one of his recommendations of how we might move from that. The prayer over the offerings, he says, this style of prayer performed over the Eucharistic elements of bread and wine is an old one. It is called a barakah, blessing prayer. The purpose of this kind of prayer was to transform every moment of one's day into a thanksgiving offering. And he's reaching back into an ancient Jewish custom and saying how the Second Vatican Council retrieved this forcefully, fully, so that we practice this kind of blessing prayer to sanctify, to offer over the various parts of our lives. But notice the recommendation. What does he say? What might we do so that we are more fully participating in the Mass here? Well, what if we took on the practice of choosing 5 times during our day when we would give praise to God for the gift of our life, such as it is, which means to look for blessing. It means don't be afraid of the hard things, but also to thank God for his presence in those hard things. To remember to thank God for the consolations that we receive, for the contact that we have with others, for the love that we experience. If any of you have ever done, say, the examen prayer at the end of the day, and you've gone back through the day and looked for blessings, you know the power of that. A subtle, steady power to remember God's presence throughout the day. Write a prayer for each of these times and pray these prayers every day. That is to say, if we get in the habit of doing that regularly, when we come to the prayer over the offerings, the bread and the wine brought before the altar to be consecrated, we'll remember, we'll be prepared to see and to participate in what's going on. That those elements which are about to be blessed, the fruit of the earth, the work of human hands, are meant to be joined to the fruit of our lives, the work of our lives. As Tim says in the chapter, that bread, that wine, it's already blessed because it's part of God's good creation. It's being offered back to become a transformed gift. So too with us. We're already blessed. Our lives are already a blessing. But we forget oftentimes, there's a lot of reasons to forget that that's the case. What is happening at this moment, the prayer over the offerings? Our lives too are being brought up into that altar. Just like in the Colic, individual separate lives are being brought into one. Like a loaf is baked out of many different grain, or wine comes from many different grapes. We're being made into one as an offering back to God to say thanks. What a beautiful, sort of wondrous thing Tim has awakened us to here. He's not inventing it. He's slowing down to pay attention to the beauty of the Mass. To say, actually, this is the beauty we're already caught up in, if we would only slow down to see it. Let me bring up one other thing then. So first was the preparation, then the participation, and a little something about practicing the movement of the Mass, practicing the Eucharistic life in our lives as they go. He writes in the last chapter on the concluding rites, so at the end of Mass, go forth, love your families, love the poor, love those on the margins, love. Think about where you live. Who in your area needs to experience the Eucharistic love of Christ? How might you share this love with those in need? This is the point, the end of the Mass, he says. In fact, Mass means to be dismissed, to go, to become this. The sort of vision that's formed in the Mass, the sort of practices we take on, the sort of choreography that we give ourselves over to, enables us to see our lives differently, little bit by little bit. And how do we do that? That we see how we've been healed in the Mass, how we've been nourished in the Mass. And when we go forth, perhaps we can become more attentive and more attuned to those who need that kind of love. That we can slow down and pay attention to all these individual moments, movements, offerings, gestures, words. They may seem separated to us at first. We might not see the whole movement. But if we stick with it, if we give ourselves over to it, we practice it, maybe we'll see what's been going on for us this whole time, what's been happening to us and for us. And I think just of this one moment he mentions at the beginning of the book. In the entrance to Mass, when incense is given over into the space, he just sort of delicately, almost quickly mentions, well, the incense, that smoke, recalls the Shekinah, God's presence coming down to dwell with his people on the top of Mount Sinai. When the angel Gabriel comes to Mary, says the Most High will overshadow you, already pointing back to that presence that dwelt on the mountain. And Tim just very quickly, but very knowingly, mentions this to us, that when we see the incense, we ought to recall that whole history, what God has been doing for us for ages, coming down to dwell, to be with us. That's just like on page 19, and it's in a couple of lines. What a treasure to slow down, to pay attention to it, to see it the whole time. The last slide, that's what Tim looks like. So, like I said, I wish he could have been here with you to share a bit of this, but I'm glad that I was able to do this, to be able to share on behalf of my closest friend, also the godfather of my oldest child. It's a great thing when the godfather of your child writes a book like this, because you can say, well, here, read this. This will form you in your faith. Well done. He doesn't even have to talk to the kid now. He just wrote a book, so he's forming him. That's excellent.
So I want to start the conversation. Well, the book was great, and it prompted a lot of thought for me. One of the things that I have struggled with, well, I'm going to start with two experiences and then throw it out to be carved up, dissected, deleted, whatever you want to do with it. So one of the things that I've struggled with, even as a child, was the missalettes that we use at Mass. That is a mystery. I mean, you need a decoder to get through that, right? And sometimes, even now, I will follow it. First of all, because I want to focus myself. But secondly, I think, what if somebody's here?
You know, there's been the comment recently in a somewhat famous, popular book by Sherry Turkle that says that really in our modern lives, we're alone together. So even when we come together, we're not actually attending to each other. We're distracted, we're withdrawn, we have lost the ability to really be present to each other. And to this point that you're bringing up, Pia, I think that's one of the things Tim's helping us to see, is that the Mass is not where our own private agendas come together and we find some kind of compromise on how we can all have our own way. In fact, we're being practiced into God's way, which is the only way that we can really be together, is not on my private terms and not on your private terms, but really on the terms that are good for both me and for you together. So when I brought up that part about the Colic, that was part of what I was seeing. That's what was jumping out to me, some of these similar things that Tim was actually drawing out. This is what's being practiced in the Mass, practicing heaven, practicing what it's like to live in God's company. Yeah, and he points out the ways in which dialogue really moves the Mass along. The dialogue between the priest who's presiding and the congregation that's gathered. Then the way in which that dialogue moves so that the priest speaks on behalf of the entire assembly to God. When we speak to God the Father, at the particular point we speak to Jesus the Son. It's a dialogue that's moving the whole time. So it's not my discourse. It's always us speaking in relationship.
I think that challenge, if you will, of audience and stage, that I'm talking to you and that's why I'm facing you. But the problem there is that's not what happens at Mass. For the majority of the Mass, I'm not talking to you. you know, but this kind of makes it look like I'm talking to you.
It's like a very bad date.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. But I'm not talking to you. We're all talking to God. But kind of our body language kind of makes that a challenge. And there's a great value in, obviously, the way we celebrate Mass, of course. We're gathered around a table, and that fosters that. But it can become a distraction, thinking this is what we're doing. It's not. We are all praying in the same direction, that is, to God. And I think it's important for us to remember that kind of before, you can pray the rosary, do your devotions, it is mentioned in the book, and I'll take care of the Mass. I'll say it, you do your stuff, we'll ring the bells when it gets important, right? It's all important. And every single person from the sanctuary to the farthest part of the church is equally involved in the celebration of the Mass in different ways, but you are called to be just as fully, actively participating as I am, no more or no less. And I loved his point in the book of being careful about activism. That participation doesn't mean that you're carrying a candle or doing a reading. Participation, first and foremost, is an interior participating in what God is doing, not in what I am doing.
Steve,
I think one of the things that struck me with what Brendan just said was that, and again, it was very early on, but you know, everything is important, and I think some of the magic of Tim breaking the Mass down the way he did was to be able to point out the importance of what actions that happen at every Mass, and a lot of times, you know, it's like, straight over my head, I didn't even pay attention to. One of the telling ones is the one on page 32 of kissing the altar.
Yes.
Something, a gesture that we witness at every single Mass. But then, he says, we're not masochists having a carnival in the midst of suffering in the world. We kiss the altar because it stands among us as a sign of Christ's total act of love. What can we do as humans but respond with a kiss to such a gift? I mean, that is just, whoa, yes. So powerful. And it's just a simple gesture that, to be honest with you, I really didn't pay attention to. I thought, okay, they're reverencing the altar.
I want to ask you, Steve, since you work with high school students, what are some of the challenges that you see in teaching high school students to enter fully into the Mass, and could this book help?
Oh, there's no challenges at all. For me, and probably our biggest challenge, and actually I'm going to steal what you said about, we're in this together alone. The kids are so isolated that there's not a whole lot of communal interaction. And I'm not saying that we don't, that the Mass, like say at Mater Dei, is an exercise in futility. It's anything but that. The participation that
Jesus always shows up.
Right. Yeah.
Amen.
Oh, him.
Yeah.
The participation that we have is phenomenal, but it is worked at from every moment. And from long times before, I thought about that question. Would this book help us? And I would have to say an unmitigated yes. That it would be a great way for the kids to be able to notice what we have right before us.
So can I just jump in here? Mater Dei is the second largest Catholic high school in the country.
Correct.
Right. So this is big. You're saying that this book could help a very big, broad audience of Catholic students.
Without a doubt.
And we're not talking about a lot of Catholic schools that are much smaller. We're talking about the second largest Catholic high school in the country.
Oh, without a doubt. And I can see us in each of our, we have, lector training programs, Eucharistic minister programs, cantor training programs. We just had 30 kids audition for the choral program, but it wasn't about the singing. It was about being minister. Mm-hmm. And to be able to present this kind of very simple but specific points, like what he said about the responsorial psalms. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, it was just absolutely magnificent. To be able to share that with our kids, I think it would make all the difference in the world.
Yeah. I was thinking if the four of us decided afterwards we'll get together for a card game, maybe a little poker, right? And it's an odd analogy, but imagine we start playing with chips, you know, different values of money. We'd have a fun time, but you lose, right? Now we switch it out, now we're putting our own money on the table, right? Everything changes. This is your money. Then your car keys, your college education for your kids, this game changes completely. And I always think of Mass, you have to have your body in there, your soul in there. It has to be sacrificial. If you have nothing to give, nothing to lose, you will get nothing. You will walk out the way you left because, yes, the Mass is always the sacrifice of Calvary made present, but it's not efficacious if we're not there, and I have to be there. And just because I'm a priest, it's no different than you, I have to be there too. Not just physically present, wearing my vestments, but I have to have skin in this, you know? Mm-hmm. I have to be on that altar, my joys, my sorrows. So the sense of giving, I think, is absolutely essential to Mass, and it's the essence of Mass, of Christ giving himself to us. But that beautiful nuptial sense of the Mass of, and I give myself to you. And I think that's shown beautifully in the celebration of Holy Matrimony within the Mass, of the couple says to God and to each other, I give myself to you until death. And then Jesus goes right after, and he says, now, this is my body, which I give up for you, and this is my blood, which I give up for you. So that nuptial blessing of the Mass, it takes two.
Oh, I love that emphasis on the bodily participation, which I think is running all throughout here, that Tim's bringing us on. Mm-hmm. We don't just participate by thought, but our bodies are caught up in this movement, this sacrifice of the Eucharist, that we know the world as whole persons, and actually it's false and it's contradictory when we encounter the world otherwise, when it's just through what we're gazing at and what we're thinking about and the distractions that we bring in, where we're separated from the place where we are and where our bodies are. And, you know, as we know, like in the early church, the fathers of the church were fond of saying, whatever is not assumed is not saved. Amen. Christ assumes the whole of the human condition to save all of it. Well, I think to your point, Father Brendan, like whatever we don't allow to be assumed by this sacrifice, if we hold it back, if we protect it, if we're afraid to give it over, we're protecting ourselves from the one who loves us. Yeah. And Tim's line that he brings back a few times, to allow ourselves to be wounded by love, to put ourselves out there, to allow that love to encounter us, bodily, emotionally, psychologically, in our words, what we say. It's Christ's way of assuming all of who we are.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Before we turn it to Q&A from the audience, I wanted to touch on one other point that I think would overlap a little bit with your work, because Lenny has done this book, Witness, which will be available for sale after the event. And it's learning to tell the stories of grace that illumine our lives. And he's also spoken at Religious Ed Congress on this and for different groups and so forth. Tim has a line in here, and so my background is moral theology. That's my passion, and that's what I love teaching. And he defines lies, describes them as bad stories caused by human sin. I love that. I absolutely love that. I mean, that translates so well into the day-to-day world, into the secular world, into the therapy world, right? And it's one of the biggest problems we have is, you know, yeah, we can be egocentric and everything, but most people don't feel that great about themselves if you scratch the surface, you know? And one of my professors, he told a story about a colleague who was preaching a mission in Trinidad, and this colleague was just giving this hellfire and brimstone homily, right? And this woman stood up from the back, and she said, "Father, we all know we're sinners. Tell us something we don't know."
Yeah, that's right.
And so I just thought of, you know, this concept of lies. These are the bad stories caused by human sin. And when we sin, we're telling ourselves that we're actually not made in the image and likeness of God. We're actually not children of God. I mean, real children, not adopted children, not grandchildren, not cousins, not, servants, children. And so it's a lie that we tell ourselves. So I just wanted to connect for a few minutes to your work and the importance of being able to tell a story of our life that is also a story of grace, that is able to see difficult situations and see them in the context of grace.
Yeah, and I think in that regard, by what light do we see ourselves, our stories, our narrative? And I think, maybe a point of connection here with what Tim said and that definition of lying. Those bad stories caused by sin, lying in the bad stories caused by sin, we're seeing what we present ourselves as, what we see others as, in a false light. That we see ourselves in this light of competition. We see the world in the light of a scarcity of goods that we can't all actually be fulfilled together by the love of God. This isn't actually God's creation. It's an arena for us to be in competition with one another in all kinds of different ways, right? So it's a sort of narrative that we get practiced in telling. We don't even realize after a while that we're telling that kind of narrative, but all of our smaller stories start to conform to it. Well, I think, here in coming into contact with the one central story of creation, that God gives life and has given it to the end in his Son, to the farthest possible horizon, that every manner and facet of created life is caught up in that narrative of love given over for us. Well, if we start to practice seeing that, to taste it, to move with it, that's the basis for telling a much better story and to start to see our own stories in that light. So I think the light by which we see our stories and we see our light is where grace comes in. It's the light.
What is it that Pope Francis said when he was asked?
I am one who is seen.
Who are you?
Who are you? I am a sinner. I am one who is looked upon by the Lord. Yeah.
Beautiful
and his
narrative.
story begins there as a disciple.
Yeah.
I am one who is looked upon by the Lord. Now I will begin seeing my life.
And that's a little bit better than the myopic view that we have of ourselves, right?
Yeah,
true.
And I think oftentimes it's more generous than we.
Well, and he, even right before that, sort of addresses the bad forms of stories, the sort of narrow stories he could tell. He says, I know some things about myself. I know that I'm a little bit astute and really, really undisciplined. So he's saying, I could tell the story of who I am according to this, according to that, to cobble together some things. But let me tell you the thing that is most important. I'm looked upon by the Lord. I'm seen. And that's how I'll start to see.
If I could, the transformative power of story, Helen and I have had the most magnificent experience of witnessing for the last
17?
17.
Yeah.
For the last 17 years. We bring a group of Mater students to Lenny's program at at Notre Dame called Vision, and an integral part of the Vision story is the telling of the stories. It is the stories told, and some of the ones that are so moving are of the college students themselves who act as the mentors in. For the kids that attend this Vision program. And to see the kids react to those stories, we just had a gathering of the Vision kids, and it says, it changed my life. And the stories are not necessarily happy stories. They are the stories of suffering. They are the stories of angst and agony, but in it, they saw that suffering can be love, as Tim said.
And that there's a context for it. There's a place to go with that suffering.
Yeah.
All right, I want to open it up to Q&A. Again, I would ask, please raise your hand. Ryan will be passing the microphone around. I would ask that the questions be questions. And again, the commentary is awesome. We'll have that after the event at our reception, but we definitely welcome the questions.
I thought that was very interesting how you said that was a polyphony of the Mass that he says, because there's also been some videos with the Jeff Cavins about the Mass and that group that also focuses on the Mass. And so it's beautiful just to continue to learn about that, to how God is talking to us, and then we're responding to Him. So that is so beautiful in our Mass.
Someone want to respond?
Yeah. I agree.
Besides saying I agree.
Yes. One thing I was thinking about, so I showed you that image from the St. John's Bible, right, with the creation. Another the entire Bible is amazing, but another part that's just absolutely astounding is the Psalter and what they did in the illustration of the Psalms. They actually took the sound waves of monks praying the Psalms. They took the sound waves of other Christian communions praying the Psalms. And then they took the sound waves of other religious groups, so non-Christian religious groups, in their forms of prayer. And all throughout the Psalter, you have those sound waves going across, almost imperceptibly. You have to know you're looking for it and really bring your eyes close. You see those sound waves moving both horizontally and vertically. That all of those voices of prayer, of longing, are being taken up in Christ's prayer to the Father. That Christ himself prayed these psalms so as to take on, in his words, our human condition. So it's a visual image of what we wouldn't otherwise perhaps see, that our voices are being taken up into Christ, and he himself, the high priest, is offering them to his Father. We're carried up into heaven by our voices. How beautiful.
So perhaps you could explain why some of the prayers at the Mass that the priest says they're not all said out loud for everyone to hear.
What are you saying up there?
Yeah, well, that happens. Now, I happen to be blessed, and Father Brendan happens to be, when we talk about engaged, yes, and you can hear every prayer that you say, but that's not true at all Masses, or I should say with all priests. There are times where the prayers are silent, or they're mumbled, they're very, very quiet, so no one can hear. And I'm wondering why that is.
My recollection, and we'll want to check our facts on this, is obviously that the Mass is traditions over 2,000 years and through different parts of the world coming together. And so obviously the essence of the Mass is it's the Last Supper made present, Calvary made present. But a lot of the traditions have kind of become broader throughout history. And during some of the parts of the Mass, of course, great music is going on. And the music could last for a long time. The Gloria or the Kyrie could last a long time. And often during these parts of Mass, the priest is still carrying out his priestly function in Mass while music is going on, kind of accompanying some of the actions in the Mass. And my understanding, some of that comes from that, kind of two actions, if you will, of the singing of a part of the Mass while the priest doing his own particular preparation. And those prayers are said silently or supposed to be. I can't remember if it says silently or quietly, but they're not meant for everybody. But they're on the internet. You can look them up in a missal. They're beautiful.
They're not secret.
They're not secret, thank you. And they're beautiful. Lord, wash away my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin. The kissing of the book of the Gospels. And they're gorgeous prayers, most certainly. But you're right, I don't know how many, 3 or 4 silent prayers, but not secret prayers. Yeah.
I also think about like Therese of Lisieux, who was obviously not a priest, and as she was preparing to receive Eucharist every time, she would recite a prayer to herself, which was not for public consumption, right? I say a prayer before I receive Eucharist every time, a very short prayer, right? So the sort of secret, or the quiet words, not the secret word, the quiet words are also a part of me disposing myself to that sacrifice, to actually being present with the rest of you there.
And I think it's important too I have like a short prayer like that as well, and it's wonderful because you become kind of automatic in it, but not in a bad sense.
Yeah.
but it's something that you do. You do consciously, and you've got it ready to go, and you are disposed with this prayer that's your own, and it's quiet, and right away it's triggering in your mind, this is that moment.
Yeah.
Another question.
I know the Mass is for all people, all ages, but I was wondering if Tim had a certain target audience in mind when he wrote this book. I'm obviously of the senior citizen persuasion crowd, but I found it very engaging. So I was wondering if he was really reaching out to a certain age group.
Tim is a very old man, actually. His heart. His very old man habit. I've known him a very long time, and he is an old man. He speaks, I think, in here, but certainly it's the case that he's thinking immediately about the students that he teaches, same students I teach, who have certain issues with the Mass or questions about the Mass or blind spots about the Mass. He's writing to them, especially those who want to continually be entertained, who go off into parish life and don't find the same kind of entertaining features that they might find in a dorm Mass at Notre Dame's campus. But out of that, he's speaking or writing to the people that he shares space with in his parish. He goes to Christ the King Parish in South Bend, Indiana. He's writing for those that he shares that space with, to the people in my parish, to the people in your parish. I think he recognizes that we all struggle with some similar things, that we don't have the access to the degree of religious formation that perhaps we should. And so from his reservoir of study and scholarship and belief is helping us to catch up. So I think you are the target audience. I'm the target audience.
I think one of the things on that also is like I said earlier, this will be very useful for us with our kids. But I was blown away when he was talking about transubstantiation as a way of seeing, not as a magic trick. Right. And then he brings up the Tantum Ergo, and I'm like, holy cow. How many times have I sung that prayer, and I see it in a totally different way now. So I think there's a universal audience to this.
And I want to just add to the format of the book, for those who haven't read it, he does, again, there's that dance between what I'm doing at Mass and what I'm doing in my personal life, right, my professional life. Then there's also each chapter, so there's some implicit practical applications, and then each chapter has a couple of questions. So it is suitable for a group discussion or a book club, and hint. And because each chapter is going to come to kind of, well, what's the deliverable? What are we doing with this? How can I go further? How can I apply it to my own life? So it's nice to have that built in, because I was talking to someone about this, and they said, "Is there a study guide?" I said, "Yeah, built into it."
Right?
Sure is.
I was wondering if you could ask Tim this question. A few people from our parish wanted to know if the book could be made available in bulk rate at a very low, reduced cost, and if parishes could buy it to give out at Christmas, Easter. You're probably aware of this book program, but this particular subject might be very good to give out to all parishes, because that's one thing we have in common as Catholics is we should have in common is going to Mass at least every Sunday.
Well, it's published by Our Sunday Visitor, and they like to sell books. Yeah. So how would they contact Our Sunday Visitor?
Yeah, I think to contact Our Sunday Visitor, they would have bulk rates at different levels, and so especially if it was for a special program. I myself haven't worked directly with Our Sunday Visitor for books, so I don't know myself, but that's the way publishers work.
I've worked with a lot of publishers, and if you want to buy a lot of books, they'll make a deal.
Yeah.
And the other way that it could be helpful is through confirmation programs throughout the country.
Sure, absolutely. Tim is a phenomenal confirmation speaker. He doesn't travel around the country and do things like this, but at our local parishes, they get him to come in because he's just excellent at it. He's engaging, he's funny, he's normal and peculiar enough that he gets the kids' attention, and then he leads them somewhere and they come away knowing something and wanting to know more. It's an amazing thing.